humanity in your hearts. You don't hate, only the unloved hate. The unloved and the unnatural. In the 17th chapter of St. Luke it is written, the kingdom of God is within man, not one man nor a group of men, but in all men, in you. You, the people, have the power. The power to create machines, the power to create happiness. You, the people, have the power to make this life free and beautiful, to make this life a wonderful adventure. Let us use that power. Let us all unite. Let us fight for a new world, a decent world, that will give men a chance to work, that will give youth a future and old age a security. By the promise of these things, brutes have risen to power, but they lie. They do not fulfill that promise. They never will. Dictators free themselves, but they enslave the people. Now let us fight to fulfill that promise. Let us fight to free the world.
Joey Clark.
Hello, welcome to the program. You're listening to the Joey Clark Radio Hour. As always, that is my humble introduction. We're going to save the world. Really, as some probably much smarter than me person said, saving the world or wanting to is really a false front to want to rule it. And it's what I'll be carrying on about, as always, but I'll try to stay in my lane because I have three amazing guests today in studio. And I love it when we have in-studio guests over the phone, that crackle. It's just awful. They're folks from the Mises Institute in Auburn. So first, the guy I've known for a while, Tho Bishop. Tho, how are you doing today?
Doing great. So good to be here.
And what's your title these days over there?
Media coordinator.
Media coordinator.
Do a lot of social media, do a little bit of writing.
Okay.
Just glad to be. Yeah, I'm a proud propagandist for the Mises Institute. Always
Wonderful.
trying to sell.
Oh, yeah, I'm a propagandist as well. So, I mean, that's what we do here on radio. Anybody takes themselves too seriously doing this job, watch out. Watch out. They'll ruin you if you believe them too much. But you have brought two fellows from the Mises Institute today. And I'll let you introduce them because this is your idea. I said, bring some folks along that are there.
Yeah, well, one of the things that the Mises Institute does, and I think it's the most important thing of what we do, is that we have a fellowship program where we have scholars from around the world that come to Auburn, Alabama, of all places, to work on research topics, papers, stuff they need for their PhDs. And so we have two here today. We have George Pickering from the London School of Economics.
Yeah, so it's a great pleasure to be able to come out to the Mises Institute each year and use their resources and libraries and all that sort of thing. So yeah, a pleasure to be on today.
Thank you for being here.
And we also have Joachim Book, who just finished his master's at...
from University of Glasgow in Scotland.
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay. So why Auburn, Alabama? Why the Mises Institute to begin, guys? Either one of you.
Well, the Mises Institute is, there are a lot of free market organizations out there in America. This is something quite new to me, having come from England, because we have about two, and each of them has an office, single piece of office space. They're not so much a big deal. But there are a lot of them in America. None of them are nearly as consistent as the Mises Institute. We live in a day and age when you'd prefer people giving the message of, free markets to not water down their message quite as much as that most of these people do. But that's just never the case with the Mises Institute. This is the most sort of pure, uncut form of Austrian economics that you're ever likely to find. So it may be in Auburn, Alabama, but it is the absolute gold standard of such places.
Well, and Auburn is incredibly lovely. What was your path?
Similar, I think. Also very attracted by the uncompromising state of the scholars at the Mises Institute, but also it's very, very inspiring. It's very, very laid back, super serious, but also super friendly. And you don't have as much of the sort of infighting that you get in a whole bunch of other organizations. It's very open. You can discuss all kinds of things. And you can oppose each other, which is nice.
Oh, absolutely. I love conversation. I was actually just sharing with the audience on my show last night some H.L. Mencken, and he says, you don't accept in your private life your friends by their flabby willingness to accept what you believe. That you respect them because they believe something strongly. And that's where my next question comes from, is I'd imagine the main draw to Mises, as you just said, it was the ideas and how consistent the ideas are presented. So let's get into what those ideas are and what exactly it is, I'll put it this way, you guys believe.
So, the Mises Institute, what we study and specialize in is what's known as Austrian Economics, of course, and it has nothing really to do with the country of Austria. It's just where some of the first scholars in this tradition, 150 years ago, came from. But it's a distinct, different way of looking at economics, and a lot of people would say, well, what's the point in distinguishing yourself as Austrian economists as opposed to, Chicago school like Milton Friedman or any of these other free market people? And there are some policy type differences that have relevance for that. But the main thing is we employ a very different method in economics than other more popular mainstream schools of thought might. So as opposed to, using all this mathematical obscurantism that, all these people in the ivory towers in mainstream economics departments use, it's a more logical, deductive method. It's much more accessible. You hear a lot of people saying, I took economics major or, economics minor in college, and I never understood it like I did until I discovered Austrian economics years later. So it's a unique way of looking at the economy with very much more consistent policy prescriptions that come from it.
Yeah, just to add to that, it's also much more focused on actual people and how they actually behave in the real world. When you go into an econ class, you get all kinds of fancy, weird assumptions that don't apply, all kinds of weird equations for how people behave, or other kinds of things that have nothing to do virtually with anything outside of the classroom. Whereas Austrian economics is much more based on how people actually behave, their actions, what stems from the fact that they're acting. It's much more reasonable.
Well, and it seems y'all are really singing to the choir here, because when in college I did a few, the basic econ classes, I wanted to do literature and philosophy and that sort of stuff. And the reason I was turned off by economics, because it's like immediately jumping into graphs, jumping into formulas. And as I picked up some of the Austrians, Rothbard and Mises, I'm like, wait, looking through this, there's maybe 1-2 graphs, but it's in Rothbard. But for the most part, it's all written word, and it's beautifully written prose often. Mises can be a little clunky, but I give him a pass for all sorts of reasons we could probably go into today. But Rothbard is incredible in that regard.
Yeah. Absolutely, and I think it's something we said. I mean, again, we're human beings. We're not numbers. There's no mathematical formula that could possibly ever predict what Joey Clark is going to do. Right. And for some listeners out there who may still have trouble kind of really grasping the differences here, since we're in Alabama, I mean, one of the things I've been enjoying talking about lately is football.
Okay.
Right? We're just about getting to college football season. You have. In fantasy football, you have all of these websites trying to apply kind of mainstream econometrics to trying to predict what players are going to do in the future.
Sure.
But of course, as any football fan could tell you, it's absolutely insane to try to predict what a power player is going to perform, right? Any play, they could injure their knee, they may get a disagreement with the coach. A star athlete, may break up with his girlfriend, and especially you never want your kicker. To have relationship troubles. I've seen it happen in Georgia several times. Their accuracy goes out the window because these are human beings, right? You can't just put something into a formula, try to create a chart and predict it. The future's unknowable, and no degree of math changes that. And the scary thing is that so much of our policy that government, not just the U.S. government, but governments across the world, believe and view everything through these lenses of econometrics and formulas and these complete abstract concepts that really disconnect from human beings themselves.
Well, and really, isn't this, I guess you could call it scientism or physics envy, and you're just talking about the essence of uncertainty. And this is where I want to move to next, is politicians in all sorts of countries say, we can guarantee you a job, we can guarantee you healthcare, we can guarantee you all these things, just give up a little bit of your liberty. So before we get into, in my opinion, I think you'll share it, the nonsense that often passes for economic policy at the government level, I have to ask a question I ask all my guests. It's pick a word, liberty or freedom. And what does it mean to you? And I don't mean give me a theoretical definition of what is liberty in the political sphere. I mean more, as you go throughout your life personally and you engage in some particular activity where you say, I feel free doing this. I feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing.
I'll let someone else go first.
I don't know. To me, freedom or liberty in my personal life just means respect people and don't take their stuff. Not much more than that. It's there are such a thing as property rights, and you should respect them. And if we don't behave accordingly, then what are we? Like,
Right.
we're not very consistent with our own beliefs. So.
That's absolutely true, and I think that's the sort of defining way of looking at things for a lot of people who believe in these sort of liberty-inclined ideas. It's this very simple central moral precept of it, which is that you shouldn't use violence in cases other than self-defense against someone or their property. And there are a lot of people who say, well, if that's the defining feature of libertarianism or whatever you want to call it, then that's surely everyone believes in such things. I don't know whether I'd go that far, but it certainly does contribute to the appeal of these ideas.
See, but I think everybody says that. And then you go out into the world and somebody, whether it's somebody they love who's sick, or maybe they're just greedy in the wrong sort of way, where they're willing to stomp on others with government privilege or their own advantage, where they, will talk a big game of, I respect others, but on this one area, I'm going to go after other people.
It's true. I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think what it comes down to is people can easily see that, you shouldn't use violence against a person, but when it comes to someone's property, they don't see the connect there. They don't see that, it's just as important, and I think that's one of the key reasons why it's so, vital to heed the, understand economics and all these sorts of things, because you can, even just from a sort of consequentialist perspective, you can understand, once you understand economics, actually these things have very real and very serious consequences if you institute policies that are, damaging people and their property as well.
Well, you anticipated my next question in the sense that I can sit up here all day. I am not an economist. I guess I have a literary understanding of it. And I know y'all are both big on the history of economic thought, and that is very interesting to me, but I usually rely on moral arguments for things like don't take my stuff, don't raise the minimum wage, because I should have the right to contract with an employer however I wish. And especially it's absurd that I can work for free as an intern, but I can't work for $3 an hour just as a little bit of a stipend. So when you understand economics, though, you can start to make arguments saying, okay, maybe you don't give a damn about my moral view of the world, but what you're doing will not achieve the outcomes you want. So we can take, first, there was actually a blog post you wrote about why are we studying these old white men, these European men. I mean, goodness.
Yeah.
What is the importance of them? And it's obviously a hot button with a lot of the social justice movement and whatnot. What were you getting at there? And of course, open to everybody to talk about the importance of these figures.
A bunch of things. Like a lot of my blogging comes from being upset with somebody else. A lot of my enthusiasm and inspiration comes from anger, which is, I don't know, I guess I share that with Rothbard and a bunch of other people.
Yes, Rothbard's motto was "Hatred is my muse," and that's what used to encourage him to write.
And there are a bunch of my friends or colleagues at my university and others who want to change economics because they think that there's too much math, too much men in there, too much not enough consideration of poor people or underprivileged people, all kinds of things. So I was sort of getting at that there is something true, objectively true in economics, and it doesn't matter if you approach that. It doesn't matter if you as an economist are a rich white male born in the 17th century or if you're a poor black woman in the 21st century. Like economics is sort of goes through that and still applies. So I was sort of getting at that we can learn from. It doesn't matter if these old people that we read, Rothbard, Mises, Adam Smith, whatever, were men and that they were white, predominantly European American. It doesn't matter. And moreover, if we don't understand the history of economic thinking, we also don't understand where we're coming from, what mistakes people are making, and a lot of the time when you look at economic policy making or whatever, and arguments that people are making, it's just like the same old fallacies that we've refuted for centuries and centuries.
That's exactly true. I mean, it's the oldest saying in the book that, those who don't learn their history are doomed to repeat it. And, John Maynard Keynes, undoubtedly the most influential economist of the 20th century, whose policy prescriptions we're suffering under still today, he was notoriously poorly read in the history of economic thought. And if he had been better read, he might have known that most of the ideas he espoused were just mercantilist fallacies that Adam Smith had refuted, back in the 1770s. So, yeah, I mean, people might be listening thinking, oh, this is all sort of somewhat academic and obscure. But I mean, if it hadn't been for Keynes, we may very well be less impoverished today by politicians who think they can micromanage the interactions of 300 million people in this country, aka the economy.
Well, but it's funny, though, some folks might find it academic and obscure, but it's interesting to me that the obscure academics practicing the dismal science who say in their conclusions, oh, we need the government to do this, they become famous. They get all the fanfare. And I wonder why. Is it some conceit? It gets back to this question of we can guarantee you something for certain, and damn it, we're going to figure out a way theoretically to justify this.
Well, I think one of the easiest explanations is just that classic Henry Hazlitt or even Frederick Bastiat idea of the seen and the unseen, right?
Right.
It's politicians can run on, okay, well, we're going to build this dam, or we're going to build this road, or we're going to create these 10,000 government jobs or whatever. America Works, House of Cards sort of stuff. But it's much more difficult to explain how letting a group of people keep how cutting taxes will give investors more money to be able to invest in an entrepreneur who has a few ideas on how to create a product that then not only will that product's creation create jobs, but then that product itself will actually make our lives a lot better. I mean, I know my life has never been the same since I first bought my first Snuggie. And so there's a lot more steps to that, right? I mean, it's more complicated. And most people don't have time for that,
Right.
So simply having a guy saying, "Hey, look, we can take your money, we can build this." That's one step, and it's to their advantage.
It is pretty straightforward, and I get the emotional appeal of often what they talk about. So let's do some specifics here. Let's start with one of the things that's come back up, and you're even seeing the so-called limited government party, the Republican Party. Goodness. They are talking about how to fix health care, and it's all focused on repealing Obamacare. The health system in this country was a mess way before that. That did make it worse. But you're seeing this argument in the United States, and they'll often turn to other countries that have experimented or implemented socialized medicine. And George, I know you have written about this recently.
Yeah, so well, obviously there's this big, controversy in the US at the moment, and people are around healthcare, and people are looking for alternatives. And so obviously the area that I know most about is the abysmal healthcare system in the UK, which is the National Health Service, the NHS, and it's an absolute, failure on so many fronts. I think there's certainly, I was half hoping that my article on this subject wouldn't be read very widely because it's such a taboo to attack the NHS. It's the ultimate sacred cow in Britain. But the article did quite well, so I suppose I'm going to have to justify myself. The problem with it is that you have this sort of myth in Britain that the NHS, in other words, a nationalised, state-controlled monopoly of healthcare, is the only way to possibly have, poor and middle-class people be able to get healthcare without being completely bankrupted. And, people are taught in the state schools and by state's politicians and on the talk shows and by the state that this is the way things are, and it's this myth. And I think you run into possibly the opposite problem in the US, where people say, anything would be better than what we have now. And people think that it was a free market in the US before Obamacare came in, and of course it wasn't. Even before Obamacare, you had over 50% of expenditure on healthcare in this country being done by the state. Hardly a free market, and now it's even more, of course. Perhaps that's what some of the problems come from. But yeah, I would urge extreme caution before looking to countries like Britain for possible alternatives. I know there's a lot of talk surrounding universal healthcare options, and if you look at the British healthcare system, it has some of the most abysmal outcomes in all of the developed world. We're in the bottom 20% for cancer survival rates in the developed world, bottom 20% for, medically preventable deaths. So, for example, I mean, Britain's healthcare system, being as it is a nationalized state monopoly, I'm sure it's the exact sort of thing many, people on the left are salivating for to copy. But, Britain is a country with a much higher GDP than some of the other countries in Slovenia, but in Europe. But our healthcare system is equivalent in quality to some of the ones in the former communist world. Like the NHS is equivalent in terms of healthcare outcomes to a country like Slovenia. If Britain's healthcare system were able to improve even to the point that it was merely equivalent in quality to the healthcare system in Spain, a country which has GDP 25% lower than Britain's, even if we got that far, it would mean 10,000 fewer Brits dying every single year from medically preventable causes, and that's a considerable number of people. I look forward to that number being chalked up on the total death toll from socialism. But yeah, I mean, the moral of the story is extreme caution in looking around the world. It's not the case that you need to have the government in charge of healthcare for poor people to get care, and indeed government meddling in this system is a lot of the reason why it's so expensive to begin with.
But the British healthcare system is number one in number of minutes spent in Olympic opening ceremonies. Praising
Oh
it.
yes,
So,
that was one of the
that's
most
a statistic that can't be overlooked.
that was, yes, in 2012 when we had our opening ceremony at the Olympics, and they had this sort of gushing overflowing of national pride in this absolutely piteous healthcare system. It was one of the most cringeworthy moments of my life.
Well, and it's amazing to me how much pride and personal pride can get, mess people up, trip people up, but national pride, how dangerous that can be. And I'm not talking about the run-of-the-mill patriots that, I've had a great life in my country and I like my people and I like my land. I'm talking about the sort of the nationalist drive to say, we're one big unit, we're all in this together, and that means we must all have the same interest. And it drives me a little nuts in that people, once you tell them exactly what you just told them, they can't think outside the box of, well, okay, how do you get health care to folks if we don't have the government doing it? But the big problem is that they've essentially destroyed any pricing system, any reasonable pricing system, and what you're getting is queuing. People are waiting and waiting and waiting.
Yeah, the problem is, the government creates the problem of overly expensive healthcare, through calculation problems that it has within all instances of state provision of services, and then it tries to solve the problem it's created by instituting another government policy, but because it's the government and the government can't do anything right, it creates all these other problems. It's like turning down the air conditioning and then thinking, it's so cold in here, I better open the window. It's just this insane way they have of looking at problems like this. So, for example, the reason we have such shortages and all this sort of thing in Britain is because they institute price controls on healthcare services and so forth. They institute a severe price control because it's actually free. It's the most price control you could possibly get. Obviously, it's free at the point of use. And so, anyone with the most terse understanding of economics could tell you that when the government artificially lowers the price of a good, of course, more people are going to go and, try and get this good. It's supply and demand. And you might think, well, that's no problem. We want people to have access to healthcare. And that's certainly true. But when the price is at zero, people no longer have to economize. People no longer have to think, do I really need to go and take up my doctor's time because I have, a runny nose or something like that, or a bit of a cough? Or would those resources be better spent on other people who are in more desperate need? And so you end up with, because of the government price controls, you've got all these people clamoring to extract services more than the supply could possibly handle, which is why throughout the entire history of a system like the NHS in Britain and all other instances of government price controls, you have rationing, you have shortages, and you have ridiculously long waiting times for major surgeries, people waiting years and years and dying while waiting for life-saving surgery because of these government price controls. And so the solution is not for the government to make healthcare more expensive by trying to provide it and then then try and make it cheaper again. The solution is just to get the state out of this industry altogether, have it as a consumer-facing business, so they actually have to care about their consumers. You know, the great Chicago economist Thomas Sowell said, you'll never understand bureaucracies until you understand that for bureaucrats, procedure is everything and outcomes are nothing. And at the moment, if you let government into your healthcare, then the lives of the people in this country will be just another outcome for them to ignore.
Well, and I have noticed another point of when this pride people have and almost faith in the state, they start to believe anything the bureaucrat or the politician tells them. And that's why, I have criticized politicians and the bureaucracies all day, but I'm starting to think there is some sense where the people are creating this outcome. That I'm not huge on democracy, and I don't have to go into a big tangent about that. Maybe, Tocqueville, I could be down with that, local democracy. But what it's become is this, you're talking about healthcare, but generally, resources in general in the nation of the economy are being fought over in a way that is, not only wasteful and inefficient, but I think it pits people against each other to where they start to think, okay, if you don't have the state system, then people aren't going to look out for one another, and they're not going to create these new products, these new services. They're not going to create new wealth because why should I? I have my piece of the pie. And have y'all seen that as you've started to study economics more and more, and this is now your expertise, is that it's one thing to be ignorant of, say, the economics of trade. It's another thing to think, okay, because I'm ignorant of the economics of trade, now really what we're in with other nations is a big battle where either one side gets the pie or the other side gets the pie, rather than let's grow the pie. Well, I mean, essentially, we were talking off air about Trump, and we all kind of like Trump's brashness, how he's upsetting a lot of the, I would say, the traditions now developed in D.C., and God love him for that. The other day he came out and he was talking about free trade and said, that's not free trade, that's stupid trade.
Yeah.
And that's the argument. How do we deal with that?
It's a problem, and I think a lot of it stems from, people don't necessarily not everyone spends their whole life studying economics, and that's to be expected.
Sure.
But so a lot of the way people's ideas develop in this sense is they'll have this basic understanding of a sort of household economy, like growing up. If my brother gets this piece of food, then I won't get it, and all this sort of stuff, and they extrapolate that to the real world. But of course, one of the most basic insights of economics is you're not going to engage in an interaction with someone unless you see it as making you better off. Otherwise, you just wouldn't do it. And it's the same on the other side. This is why if you have a free market, and if you don't have a state holding a gun to people's heads and telling them they have to do X, Y, and Z in the economy, you can assume that from people's own perspectives, each trade makes them better off because they wouldn't have done it otherwise. And that's it's no less true for international trade than it is for individuals interacting in a shop or something like that. People think of international trade and suddenly their brain goes out of the way they might think of two individuals interacting in a shop, and suddenly they're thinking of, nations and these vast forces. But it's really no different. It's not America trading with China. It's a particular person or a particular business buying and selling stuff with a particular person and a particular business in China. Just because they're on different, parcels of land on the face of the earth doesn't mean that the principle's any different. So of course international trade is going to make people better off from their own perspectives by the exact same token that it would, buying something from someone in a shop is going to make you better off from your own perspective, because otherwise you wouldn't have done it. And so, Trump I find him very amusing, and I think he's the most entertaining president you guys have had for quite some time, but at least since Bush Jr. But he's completely wrong on this issue, and he clearly fails to understand it.
Well, I think there's two big things that are, Trump in part takes this position because it's relatively popular.
Sure.
And I think there's two reasons for that. One is that people, again, they don't see the unseen here, which is that if you put a tariff on foreign goods, well then, chances are that's not going to lead necessarily to a huge influx of people manufacturing those goods here. They're just going to pass that cost, that tariff on to consumers, right? So again, it's the same thing as you tax businesses. Businesses don't, they're not just going to take that loss. They're going to increase the prices of their goods. Same thing with tariffs. But the other side, the real background here is he wants to create jobs, right? And people, and there's always this great anxiety, understandably so, about losing jobs to outsourcing and that sort of stuff. So it's perfectly understandable. But what needs to be understood is that, for one, again, jobs themselves are not the ends, right? It's what you get from your job. It's what you're able to buy. It's the purchasing power. It's being able to provide more for your children so that your children can start life from a better standing than you did. That's, I think, the big goal of most honest Americans. And so what needs to be understood is that, okay, so when certain jobs either are outsourced or because they can produce cheaper elsewhere, or just simply innovated away.
Right.
If you're a taxi driver who loses a job because Uber's gotten better. What the economy does, and we see this time and time again, is that it creates new opportunities for new businesses that we could never have thought of before. And I'm gonna go back to the fantasy football because got a draft coming next week. You have people making money simply analyzing NFL stats. I mean, people pay. You can make a good. You can make $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year dedicated to fantasy football. I mean, that's insane. I mean, if you were a government and you were the one allocating jobs, nobody's going to allocate that job. No, that's created by the market,
yes.
And the market, and that's only able to happen because it's so much cheaper to buy food. It's so much cheaper to buy clothes. It's so much cheaper to even get a car relatively. And so when people spend less money on their tomatoes, well, that's more money they can spend elsewhere. And a lot of that time it goes to luxuries. And so you would not have pet groomers or all these sort of great things.
Right. You wouldn't have a radio host.
Right. You would have if it wasn't cheaper, if you weren't finding cheaper, more efficient ways of producing those core necessities.
Right.
And that's something, again, I think it's not something that I think is explained as well as it could be.
Right.
And I think that's one of the biggest issues that people have a hard time seeing the longer picture there, and understandably so. Again, there is steps to this process. And this is why understanding economics and as a community, teaching economics, especially at a younger level, in better ways, more ways that connect with people more, is so vitally important. Not just for our own individual well-being, but for society as a whole. Because a economically capable country, or a well-educated country, can do better things and can avoid a lot of these pitfalls that government creates for us.
Well, and I think if you aren't at least, as you put it, at least a terse understanding of economics, that you won't even see certain political issues. So one that I haven't actually brought up in a while, but I have to now that y'all are here. Ron Paul made this famous in the Fed. How do y'all feel, and not really just feel, what do you think of the central banks of the world and our current just monetary regime here in the States, worldwide, what it's doing to our economy? Because there are it's a big question, but there are a lot of people who would go, why do they hate the Fed? Why do they hate the central banks? Why do they want to get rid of them? They manage the money.
Where do you want to start? Most of all, they're based on this very, very strange hubris that a few people in a room can decide on the most important price of all. That is the price of interest, the price of taking out loans and things. And that should apply for the entire economy of 300 million people. It's absolutely absurd that they would even have the information to do it, that whatever outcome they find would be the appropriate one. Not even to mention their own stated goals of, price stability and, preventing inflation and things, when they have been the institution that's created most inflation in the history of inflation. Basically, the idea of a central bank is so absurd on so many levels that it's insane.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, you said, where do you start? Well, where indeed? There are lots of problems with this institution, but fundamentally, central banks around the world, especially and including the Federal Reserve, it's a scam. it's a scam, and they cause, there are many problems with them, as I say. You know, great Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises proved that they cause business cycles that leave so many people unemployed every few years, and there are other problems with them. But I think one of the things that hits home with people most is, you know, you ever notice how you can't just put money in the bank account and then years down the road you've got enough, to retire on? It's because they're inflating away the value of people's savings. And I think a lot of people have this sort of understanding that, government prints money and it causes inflation. The money becomes less valuable because there's more of it. People understand the outcomes, but they don't really understand the process. It doesn't just happen by magic. What happens is, the new money goes out into the system, the Fed creates it out of thin air, loans it into existence, and the first people who get their hands on it before the value of it's been deflated away. They grab it when it's still at full value, and then they use it, they spend it, and it bids up prices, all this new money, because there's so much more of it sloshing around in the system. And only eventually does the inflation take place and the value of people's savings is destroyed as the new money percolates out into the system. So, in other words, the people who get the money from the Fed first effectively taking away purchasing power from the people who get it last. So it's the people who get it first, governments and the big banks who are in bed with the governments. They're effectively diminishing the purchasing power of ordinary people's savings through this scam, like I say. And that's one of the things that hits home with people the most. I mean, it also, like I said, the Fed causes the business cycle through, artificially depressing interest rates. It causes people to invest in, lines of production that they wouldn't otherwise have invested in, and for which the accumulated resources don't actually exist to see these things through to a profitable completion. When the Fed prints money out of nothing, it doesn't cause new resources to come into existence. It just creates an illusion of that. Eventually, the veil is pulled away, and people realize that these things they've been investing in for years are not going to be profitable because the Fed causes the business cycle. And so, there's no shortage of problems with this institution, but the long and short of it is that end the Fed.
And you'd think our friends on the left would be on this issue, right? Because what George is describing is that this is an active policy, an institution whose primary function is to benefit Wall Street at the expense of everyone else. I mean, that's the way it is.
And furthermore, with all this talk of, Amazon's becoming a monopoly, right. This is a monopoly, yes. Granted by the government. It's remarkable to me. And one part of their inflationist policy is this sort of article of faith in mainstream economics, if you want to call it mainstream, is that deflation, always bad. Deflation. Can you speak to that? Where do they get this idea? Because you look at some of the greatest growth periods in the United States history, say the late 1800s, you had deflation, but you had incredible growth and wealth, and the middle class rising out of the muck and the mud, essentially. So where did this idea come from that deflation is always bad?
Well, and for those listening who may not fully understand what deflation, imagine this is for example, if you bought a PS4, when it first came out, it was like $500 a system. Now you can get it for what, $250. That price is cut in half. Well, that's price deflation right there. It just simply means that goods and services can be bought at a lower price than they were before. It's a lowering of in price terms, it's a lowering of the cost.
A general fall in prices.
And now there's another. Now, and the thing is that there's actually a big word game going on here, because when the central banks talk about deflation, that's what they're talking about, lowering prices. When a monetary economist might say deflation's a bad thing, they mean the actual lowering of the money as a whole, right? So for example, when economists try to justify their fear of deflation, they'll point to, for example, when the UK went back to an old gold standard, and so basically they were on a gold standard. The war hit. They printed a bunch of new money, and then after the war, they tried to go back to that original gold standard. Well, they've already created all this new money. What they needed to do was have that effect in the cost of gold. Well, they didn't. So you had a actual decrease in the money itself, and that's bad too, right? We want basically a stable money. But price is lowering. which is what central banks warn us about. That's their big boogeyman. That's something that we should actually, as consumers, relish. It would make us all better off.
That's exactly true. And just to touch on this thing, about the UK and the deflation they had, which a lot of people attribute the severity of the Great Depression to. I don't want to get into the weeds here because people listening will fall asleep behind the wheel. But just the very basic thing of it is, people on the left will say, deflation is terrible, gold standard, it's all terrible. Don't you know that Winston Churchill said putting Britain back on the gold standard was one of the biggest mistakes of his career? Yes, we all know that, but it wasn't a true gold standard, and the problems that rose out of it were due to government meddling with it. So basically, in very brief terms, in the 19th century, there was effectively a gold standard. Gold was money, or it was paper backed by gold, and it was all fine, great prosperity, industrial revolution, just all fantastic stuff. Then you have the First World War. These governments could not possibly have kept that war going for as long as they did had they not taken their countries off the gold standard and just printed money into existence. That terrible war would not have lasted as long if they'd stayed on the gold standard, but they didn't. Printed up a whole load of new money. After the First World War's over, they want to return to the, great trade and prosperity of the 19th century, and so they peg the currencies back to gold. But because they're politicians and they're dumb, they did it at the pre-war parity, which is to say, if, let's say, before the war, for every £100 you had 100 ounces of gold or whatever. It wasn't that, but just to keep the math simple here.
Right.
After the war, they print a whole load of money. So now for every £1,000 you have 100 ounces of gold, and that's what caused a lot of the problems, because there wasn't enough gold for people to be able to redeem it. The money collapsed. It was made everything much too expensive in trade. And so, to say that the gold standard caused all of the problems that happened in, the interwar period would be like if I said, I'm a pacifist. Oh, actually, now I'm not a pacifist anymore, and for 5 minutes, I'm going to be a non-pacifist, murder everyone in the room, and then I go back to being a pacifist later, and it's like, everyone died while I wasn't a pacifist then. I guess pacifism must be not the way to keep people alive. It's just the worst kind of economic history fallacy you can possibly imagine, and it's poorly taught in schools.
And most of it is not. It's not even that different from when we're thinking of say the latest crash in the housing bubble. It's the same sort of argument. So most of this deflation comes from after an inflationary period, you have to deflate the money supply again to bring back the standard to gold. And then most economists say, this is so bad and it caused all kinds of crisis, and like the central banks or the governments are manufacturing unemployment, which is basically the same argument that people use after the housing boom, for instance. So the housing boom collapsed, everybody realizes, okay, there was something wrong here. There was a whole bunch of resources being malinvested that shouldn't have gone into these resources, or shouldn't have gone into these sectors, shouldn't have produced the things they were producing. People shouldn't have worked with this. They should have done something else to satisfy consumers. And then at that point, people say, no, we have to keep the boom going. Like, we can't deflate it. Like, the fact that people now are unemployed is the worst thing happening. No, like, this is a result of the mistakes that you've done over the last decades. And in the case of Britain, or in the case of U.S. history, in the inflationary period, if you've gone off the gold standards and things, and you've had problem with deflation, it's that the government have been messing up things for decades, and now the market is trying to fix it.
Right. This hour, by the way, is flying by. We only have about 8 minutes left, so it is something I've worried about, where folks will say, we want everybody to have a home, and instead of letting, say, home prices fall, which makes it easier for people to buy homes, no, let's give subsidies, or they're doing this with healthcare now. Instead of fixing healthcare and allowing the market to work and letting healthcare prices for all sorts of things fall, no, we're going to give the insurance companies and now consumers subsidies. Even the Republicans are advancing this idea. And generally, when I see what people want in politics out of the economy, they're treating the economy like this big machine that they can, punch certain inputs into, and you'll make this complex network behave how you want to, and it creates incredibly bad outcomes. Because we're so short on time here at this point, we've talked about a good bit of ideas, touched on a few. Where would you suggest that people go if they wanted to learn and do some self-study for themselves?
There is only one answer to this question. Mises.org, the website of the Mises Institute, that's MISES.org. And And this is one of the best things about the Mises Institute, which is, of course, if you're just tuning in, that's where we're all the guests of this hour from. The wealth of educational material on that website is just unbelievable. Hundreds and hundreds of free books, free audio books even, lectures you can watch, very entertaining ones. And articles, daily topical articles every day. You could go into that site and never be seen for the rest of your life because there's so much fantastic educational material there, especially on this Austrian school, so-called, of economics, which is the real uncompromising stuff that, lots of people have been turned on to in recent years, and it gives you suddenly a unique perspective on the things we're suffering through today.
Well, and I've heard, especially for all of y'all, I've heard the slogan, read Rothbard. Murray Rothbard. If somebody wanted to start off with Murray Rothbard, I have a few of my own ideas, but where would y'all suggest?
Personally, well, one of the most popular places to start with Rothbard is an essay he wrote, and it's popular because it's so short. It's called The Anatomy of the State. And that's not really economics per se, but it's him, just describing in very simple terms what a state actually is and what it's done. It's not this sort of mythical institution. It's not the embodiment of the people, whatever that means. It's just an institution that claims the legal right to use violence in society against people, peaceful people and their property. And so a lot of people start there. Personally, I think it's pretty hard to go wrong with anything Rothbard wrote. He's a very entertaining writer. He wrote in a very light way. And so, his great economic work is called Man, Economy and State. That's a very long book, but it's very good. He also had a brilliant book called For a New Liberty, which is a sort of, his manifesto, which is my personal starting off point that I'd recommend. So For a New Liberty by Murray Rothbard.
Well, with Rothbard, there's one book that's actually just a collection of kind of pop articles, basically brief examinations of different economic things. It's called Making Economic Sense. It's not quite as popular as some of his other books, but I think just for a beginner, there's a lot of good stuff there. For more on the money issue, there's a very short read called What Has Government Done to Our Money? It's one that Ron Paul would hand out a lot. I think that's a great way to start. And just really for economics as a whole, it's a cliched answer. It's Mike Rowe's favorite economics book. But it's one that if you're really interested in it and you're willing to just invest 250 pages of your reading 250 pages to really understand all of this, Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt is still the gold standard. Years and years after, Henry Hazlitt himself is actually one of the founders of the Mises Institute, one of the founding members. He's absolutely brilliant. And that's another one. If you're interested in this at all, Economics in One Lesson, which you can read free at Mises.org.
Mises.org.
It's a great book.
And before we go, I have to share this. Most of the audience here, I think, is conservative. Usually these airways are conservative talk. And there's a name I'm sure they know, Judge Andrew Napolitano.
Oh, yes.
Y'all have an event coming up Monday night, right?
Well, this is my personal favorite time of the entire year. Next week we have our Mises University event, which is a week-long event, and it's absolutely incredible. We'll have 150 attendees. Students from all around the world. We have someone from Venezuela coming in to this event so he can learn capitalism, try to go back to his country and save people. It's incredible stuff, incredibly heroic stuff. And one of the great features of Mises U is that for the entire week, Judge Andrew Napolitano is there. He actually teaches a 5-part constitutional law class for some of the students. But on Monday night at Auburn University at Louder Hall, starting at 6:30, he'll be doing a talk. It's about a 45-minute long talk. He'll be covering a lot of stuff. I think the title is An Evening with Judge Andrew Napolitano, so that won't help as far as the actual discussion. But he's one of the most incredible narrators of the day-to-day, if not the best. He was, again, Trump's go-to guy when trying to decide who he should appoint to the Supreme Court. He is just an incredible human being. And we have about 100 extra seats. This is the first time we've ever done a Mises University talk outside of our complex. First time we've opened up the judges' talk to the public. It's an incredible opportunity. And if you have any questions at all, we have it on our website, Mises.org. You can send emails to Pat, Pat at Mises.org, and she can help connect you with seats. But if you have the opportunity, again, 6:30 Monday night, Louder Hall at Auburn University. You will never forget seeing Judge Napolitano in person.
Indeed. And how much is it going to set people back to see this?
And as the Mises.org, we are all about giving out free stuff. So we have, again, 100 free seats available to the public.
Right, I thought y'all were capitalist pigs.
I know, we should be charging this thing up. We're going to have a...
No, this is being a capitalist pig, reducing the price to zero, giving stuff away.
That's true. Yeah, you're not going to forget the talk with Judge Napolitano, believe me. So yeah, if you can make it to Auburn that evening, come and join us and watch him.
Well, and I'm going to second that because it is remarkable. I've watched, I think, every single one of the speeches he's done for Mises U on YouTube, and I have to make it up there Monday night. I'll have to run a replay or something because he's amazing. I must meet him in person, and I encourage everybody here listening to go.
Well, and the Mises Institute is so lucky to have. Again, he's a board member of the Mises Institute, good friend, and so we have people like Ron Paul and like Judge Napolitano, who reasons why the Mises Institute is what it is. And again, we're just in Auburn, Alabama. We're open, throughout the week. We have tons of resources. We'd love to get out. If you're ever in Auburn University and you're interested in seeing this stuff, just stop by, talk to some people there. We love having people stop by. It's a unique place. It's a special place, and take this for what it's worth, coming from an official propagandist for the Mises Institute. But I really think it's the most important organization really in the world right now, because these ideas are so important, especially in today's world, and our reach genuinely is international. We have you had students in Brazil marching for these ideas. You have people in China talking about these ideas, and throughout all of Latin America, throughout Europe. These are the ideas that can bring civilization, humanity to where we need to be and bring peace and prosperity to the world.
Well, and the ideas I found at the Mises Institute, I discovered them too late as I was leaving Auburn University, and they've inspired me. And they've done incredible things for me. And I really think, folks, if you're out there and you're a little depressed with politics, that neither side it's easy to happen. Neither side is really speaking to you. The best time then is to study. If you can't find anything in the political arena, go fill your own mind, change your own mind, change your own life, and I think you'll find in the end you'll meet a lot of people who think just like you. So guys, thank you so much for coming in today. That went fast. I'll have to have some somebody back. Absolutely.
Thank you so much.